I want to talk about something I don't love admitting, something I've judged myself for and what others have too. And I've tried to fix it, but it hasn't gone to plan. Something I've hidden behind competence, intelligence, and achievement. And I only seem to do things at the last minute, not sometimes, not occasionally, not in the quirky, ha ha, I work well under pressure way. I mean, consistently. You could predict it. And it's just painful. And I really dislike that about me. I hate the way that it looks from the outside, how it feels inside of my body, and the stories that I feed into my head, because the story always goes something like this. If you'd have just started earlier, you wouldn't be so stressed. If you really cared, you'd have done it already. If you were more disciplined, this wouldn't keep happening. You're an adult. Why is this still a problem? And maybe you're listening to this thinking, oh, crikey, she's in my head. Because you know this pattern, and you know the watching the clock with that dread feeling, the avoidance that doesn't feel like laziness, but it doesn't feel like rest either. And that weird paralysis where you want to do the thing, but your body absolutely refuses to cooperate. And you know the shame spiral that kicks in long before the deadline ever arrives. And then just at the last minute, something switches on. Your brain is suddenly sharp, it's focused, and it's fast. You get it done in hours what you couldn't touch for weeks. And everybody says, see, you can do it. But what they don't see is the actual cost. They don't see the stress that it took to get there. The adrenaline, the cortisol, the internal violence of forcing yourself through it. And they just don't see how exhausted you are afterwards, or how much you hate that this seems to be the only way that your brain knows how to move. So today I want to talk about the last minute living. And I'm not going to glorify it, and I'm not shaming it, and I'm not going to offer you a color-coded planner and a dopamine chart. But I am going to tell you the truth about it, because the ADHD, autistic, and CPTSD, wired brains, this isn't a time management issue. It's a nervous system story. So let's start with something that's important. Most of us didn't wake up one day and decide, you know what would be fun? Living in a constant state of low-grade panic. We didn't choose this pattern, but we did learn it. And for a lot of us, it was learned early. And if you grew up in environments where things were unpredictable, safety wasn't consistent, or attention came with pressure and mistakes had consequences, or performance was how you stayed accepted, and then urgency wasn't familiar, it was functional. Pressure meant movement, and adrenaline meant clarity, and crisis meant focus. Calm was alien, or it often meant waiting, bracing for something and being watched. So your body learned something very specific. I move when it matters. I act when it's urgent. I focus when there's a threat. And deadlines, Deadlines feel like a threat. And it's not intellectually. There's absolutely no logic to it, but somatically. And your body doesn't hear, this is due on Friday. What your body hears is perform or else. Get it right. Don't mess this up. You'll be judged. So of course you freeze. I mean, that is perfectly logical, because freeze is what happens when your system detects danger but doesn't yet see a safe way through. It's not a laziness, it's just who we are, and I think it's just biology. And if you add ADHD to the mix, ADHD brains don't run on importance. They run on interest, novelty, challenge, and urgency. So when something is boring or abstract, long-term, or emotionally loaded, your brain doesn't get the chemical signal it needs to engage. Until, of course, there's a deadline. A clock tick-tocking. A consequence. Then, of course, the dopamine spikes, the adrenaline floods in, and suddenly, there you are. It feels like, oh, this is who I'm meant to be. You're focused. You're efficient. You're brilliant. And this is where it just gets cruel, because that last minute version of you, she's real, she's capable, and she's smart. But accessing her requires stress. So your nervous system learns stress equals access, and you end up resenting yourself for needing the very thing that is hurting you. And if you're autistic or you have autism and ADHD, deadlines can also feel like demands, and demands can trigger demand avoidance, which isn't because you don't want to comply, but because compliance feels like a loss of autonomy. Especially if you have spent years masking, people pleasing, pushing past your limits, doing what was expected at the cost of yourself. Your system might push back hard against external pressure. So now you've got ADHD needing urgency, the autism resisting demand, and the trauma reacting to threat, all colliding around a calendar date. No wonder it's so friggin' messy. No wonder you hate it. But this is what I don't want. Actually, this is what I don't hear people talking about enough. Doing things at the last minute often works. That's what makes it so confusing. You get the result, you meet the deadline, and sometimes you even get praise. And that just reinforces that pattern. But just because something works doesn't mean that it's kind. It doesn't mean that it's sustainable or even that it's healthy. It also doesn't mean that it's the only option, of course. It just simply means your system found a way through. And survival systems are incredibly clever. And I'd like you to hear this, because I know how deep the shame runs. And do you feel like you're irresponsible, or do you ever consider yourself childish, or do you think of yourself as broken? Or obviously you're none of those, but you did actually do something that was really smart. You adapted. You learn how to function in environments that weren't designed for your brain. You managed to learn how to access focus under pressure. You also learn how to deliver when it mattered the most. That doesn't look like failure to me. That looks like a skill. A costly one at that, but still a skill nonetheless. And just take this in, because there is a narrative out there that says you just need better habits. You need accountability. You need stricter deadlines. You need to stop enabling yourself. And for trauma-wired brains, that advice could actually be harmful, because adding more pressure to a system already overwhelmed by pressure doesn't create regulation. It could create a collapse, a burnout, a shutdown, or even rebellion. And I've done that many, many a time. So the goal here is not how do I force myself to start earlier. The goal is how do I build enough safety that urgency isn't the only key that works. And that's a very different question. And I don't think I've heard many people admitting to this. Sometimes we hate starting things, not because they're hard, but because starting means committing. And committing means being seen, risking failure, discovering limits, finding out that it's not perfect. And when you leave things till last minute, something interesting happens. You don't have time to overthink. You don't have time to doubt yourself. You don't have time to make it perfect. You just do it. Last minute work bypasses the inner critic. It silences the perfectionism. It shuts up the fear. And if you grew up in environments where mistakes weren't safe, or where being not good enough had real consequences, it just makes sense. The rush protects you. So when people say, why don't you just start earlier? What they're really asking is, why don't you just sit longer with uncertainty, fear, and self-doubt? And your brain is like, absolutely not. The problem isn't that you only do things at the last minute. The problem is that the last minute is the only time your system feels allowed to move. That's the difference. And that means the work isn't about discipline. It's about permission, safety, and choice. Well, I'm not going to tell you to stop doing things last minute. I mean, that would be completely unrealistic and honestly a bit disrespectful to the intelligence of your nervous system. Instead, I want to offer a gentle reframe. What if last minute action isn't something to eradicate, but something to understand? What if instead of saying, I hate this about me, you said, this makes sense and I'm allowed to look for other ways too? Not replace, but expand. Because the goal isn't to never use urgency again. The goal is to understand that urgency isn't the only door that I can walk through. And that takes a lot of time and safety and experimentation, and it doesn't need shame. Let's just have a moment. And if you're listening and feeling seen and uncomfortable and relieved all at once, that's perfectly okay. That's usually the sign that we're telling the truth to our own bodies. And in the next part, I want to talk about why starting earlier often backfires and what actually helps trauma-wired brains begin without panic. And also how to build choice around time instead of being at war with yourself. And for now, just know this. If you're only doing things at the last minute, that doesn't mean that you're failing at life. It means your nervous system learned how to survive, and you don't need to punish it for that. Let's just keep going. Because once you start telling the truth about this, something interesting happens. The shame starts to loosen its grip. The space opens up for curiosity. And one of the most frustrating things about this pattern is that people assume the solution is obvious. Just start with 5 minutes. Just do a little bit every day. The amount of times that somebody has said that to me. Now, if those things worked for you, you would already be doing them, right? But for most of us with ADHD, autism, and trauma histories are not short on insight. We are not unaware, and we're certainly not unmotivated. That's not what this is about. We've probably already tried all of those things, downloaded the apps, bought the planners. I mean, I have absolutely dozens of them. Most of them, I've got a few words in them, and that's about it. We've color-coded, we've time-blocked, accountability partnered ourselves into exhaustion. And still the body doesn't move, which is often where the self-blame really kicks in. Because when something doesn't work, after repeated effort, the mind goes looking for a reason. And the most available explanation is, it must be me. What else could it be? But this is something that doesn't get said enough. If a strategy only works when you're calm, resourced, and safe, it's not actually a strategy for trauma-wired lives. And that's what we don't talk about enough. And it is simply a luxury. For a lot of us, starting earlier sounds reasonable in theory. Would you agree? But in practice, starting earlier often means sitting longer with the uncertainty, feeling the weight of expectation for more time, having more hours to doubt yourself, more opportunity for perfectionism to take over. Oh, and also more chances to abandon the task entirely. And when you start early, the task lives in your body for longer. And if your body associates tasks with pressure, judgment, or past failure, that can feel pretty unbearable. So your system does something clever. It waits. It waits until the window for overthinking closes, until urgency narrows your options, or until there's no room left for debate. Last minute equals clarity. And it isn't because you love chaos, but because chaos limits choice. And sometimes limited choice feels safer than infinite possibility. And this is especially true if you grew up having to get things right, if mistakes were punished, maybe failure had consequences, and if being too slow, too much, or not good enough was noticed. And in those environments, waiting until the last minute can be a form of self-protection. Because if you fail under extreme pressure, there's an explanation. And if you fail with time and space, it feels like a verdict on who you are. So again, this all makes sense. And I want to talk about something that often hides underneath last-minute patterns: grief. Grief for the version of you who you think should exist. The version of who starts early, the one who's consistent or who doesn't need stress to function, the one who finishes things calmly without drama. I'm always yawning. I know, I'm sorry. There can be a lot of mourning there because you know you're capable, you're intelligent, and you know that you have ideas, depth, and creativity, and yet time keeps being a battlefield. Doesn't that hurt? And it's okay to ask that. What about another truth that might feel uncomfortable at first? Some deadlines are genuinely unreasonable. It isn't because you can't meet them, but because of what they cost you. We live in a culture that praises output and ignores nervous systems, that rewards urgency and calls it productivity. This treats stress as a motivator instead of a warning sign. So when your body resists, it's not always a flaw. Sometimes it's information, and sometimes your freeze isn't saying, I can't. It's saying, this pace is just not safe for me at the moment. I'm going to be a little bit careful here, because what I am not saying is throw out all of the deadlines, or only do things when you feel like it. That's not realistic either. What I am saying is, though, you're allowed to question the systems you're trying to function inside. You're allowed to notice which deadlines are necessary and which ones are inherited or internalized or imposed without consent. You're allowed to renegotiate where possible. Excuse me. And where it's not possible, you're allowed to build support around the impact, and that's regulation. What it isn't is avoidance. Let's talk about something practical, but still gentle. For trauma-wired brains, starting isn't about willpower. It's about safety cues. The question isn't, how do I force myself to begin? It's, what would make beginning feel even 5% safer? And if anybody's got any tips on how I can stop yawning all the time, I'd like to know. And talking about, feeling even 5% safer, that might look like removing the audience, lowering the standard temporarily, starting in private, starting imperfectly on purpose, and starting with a container instead of a goal. And sometimes the safest way to start is to tell yourself, this is a draft and nobody's going to see it. This is a mess on purpose. And this does not need to be good. And you're just being so much kinder to yourself. Perfectionism and freeze often travel together. Not because you want excellence, but because you've learned that being wrong wasn't safe. And capacity is another piece people miss. And if you're already emotionally stretched, sensory overloaded, holding other people together, managing chronic stress or pain, then your system might not have spare capacity for starting early. Last minute action often happens because it borrows energy from tomorrow, usually from your reserves, your nervous system's emergency supply. That's why it feels so awful afterwards, and that's why compassion really matters. You don't need to make your brain work like other people's because we're told to. You don't need to turn yourself into someone who thrives on pressure or someone who never needs it. The goal isn't transformation, it's choice. And choice means I use urgency when it suits me. Sometimes I create safety. I can negotiate timelines. And sometimes I collapse and rest. I ask for help if I need it. None of those things make you weak. They make you responsive. And if you're listening to this and thinking, okay, but I still have deadlines. Yeah, you do. And you're not failing because they're hard. You're navigating them with a nervous system shaped by experience. That deserves a bit of respect. Doing things at the last minute does not mean that you don't care, or, often it means that you care so much that your body won't let you touch it until it absolutely has to. That's not apathy, it's protection. And in the final part of this episode, I would like to talk about how to hold yourself with less contempt when this pattern shows up, how to stop using shame as a motivator, and how to build a relationship with time that isn't based on fear. But for now, if nothing else has meant anything, let this matter. You're not lazy or defective. And I wonder how many times you may have heard this part, being said to you. You are responding exactly as a nervous system does when it learnt that pressure was the only safe way through, and you are allowed to want something gentler. And without shaming what kept you alive. And where I want to end this isn't with advice, it's with relationship. Because most of the pain around deadlines and last minute living doesn't come from deadlines themselves. It comes from how we speak to ourselves about them. And if you've spent years telling yourself things like, why am I like this? I never learn. I'll do better next time. I hate this about me. Then your nervous system isn't just dealing with time pressure. It's also dealing with self-attack. And shame is such a terrible motivator. It doesn't create change. It creates compliance collapse or rebellion. Sometimes even all three. And many of us were taught, directly or indirectly, that if we were hard enough on ourselves, that we would improve. That self-criticism would keep us sharp, and kindness would make us lazy, and that the pressure was necessary. But if any of that were true, you would be absolutely thriving by now. And you've been so hard on yourself for years. And yet this pattern persists, most likely not because you haven't tried hard enough, but because the shame never teaches safety. Gosh, imagine speaking to yourself the way you would speak to a small child who freezes under pressure. You wouldn't say, why didn't you start earlier? What's wrong with you? You've had ages. Because you know what that already feels like. You'd probably say something like, this feels big, doesn't it? No wonder you're struggling. Let's take this one step at a time. That doesn't mean you remove the expectations. It means that you remove the cruelty. And that distinction really matters. And you can hear the difference, can't you? One of the most radical shifts that you can make, and I'm not saying that lightly, is stop using urgency as proof of your worth. So many of us have internalized the idea that we're only valuable when we're producing, only acceptable when we're delivering, only safe when we're performing. Deadlines then become more than dates, they become verdicts, and that's too much for any nervous system to hold. And if you want to change your relationship with last minute living, this is where I would actually start, with permission, not with time or with productivity, but permission to notice, to be curious, to stop pretending that this is a moral failure. Questions like, what does my body do when a deadline appears? What memories does urgency stir? Where do I learn that pressure equals safety? And what happens if I soften the language I use with myself? These aren't productivity questions. They're regulation questions. And yes, sometimes you will still do things at the last minute. And this won't undo the work, but it is the work. Because healing doesn't mean that you need to be erasing patterns. It just simply means meeting them differently, with less contempt, with more understanding, with choice where there used to be compulsion. And I also want to say this because it matters deeply. Some people will never fully understand this experience. They'll give advice that works for their nervous systems, assume resistance equals lack of care. They'll think starting earlier is simply a preference. I mean, you don't have to convince them. You don't have to justify your wiring, and you don't have to earn compassion by suffering quietly. Your experience is valid even if it's invisible. You are navigating time with a nervous system shaped by adaptation, intelligence, and survival, and that deserves respect, especially from yourself. So, the next time you find yourself doing something at the last minute, instead of thinking, here we go again, try something softer, something like, okay, this is how my system is accessing movement right now. This makes sense. I don't need to punish myself for this. And you can still meet the deadline. You can still want something different, and you can do both without shame. The goal isn't to become someone who never struggles with time, but it is to stop turning time into a weapon against yourself. And if this episode felt uncomfortably familiar, if you've felt seen and exposed and relieved all at once, I want you to know that it wasn't accidental. This conversation is long overdue, and we are together in it. I leave you with this. You survived in systems that taught you pressure was the price of belonging. And now, slowly and gently, you get to build a life where safety comes first, even with deadlines. I would like to thank you for listening and for staying, and thank you for not giving up on yourself, even when time has made that really hard. You're allowed to take up space here, exactly as you are. Even if, if this episode resonated, it really helps when you like or comment, not for vanity, but because it tells the algorithm that conversations matters. And if there's something you're quietly struggling with, something you wish someone would talk about, then please tell me in the comments or leave a review so that I can see if this mattered to you. I read all of them. And a lot of this podcast exists because someone once said, "Is it just me?" I know this stuff isn't always light. Talking about time, pressure and shame can sometimes stir things up. Or, sometimes it's just about knowing that there are other people going through something similar. So if listening to this brought anything up, just take a breath and put your feet on the floor and let your body know that you're here and that you're safe. And you don't need to take any action right now. You don't need to reflect harder or do better. Sometimes understanding is the work. Thank you for being here and for staying curious instead of being cruel to yourself. And as always, until next spiral.